For centuries, the story we were taught about exploration and empire sounded almost heroic. Brave ships crossing unknown seas, kings expanding civilization, faith spreading to distant lands. But beneath that polished narrative lies a truth far more uncomfortable and far more important to understand. Long before slavery became an economic system, it was given something even more powerful: legitimacy. European empires did not act alone. They were backed by papal decrees that divided the world on paper before it was conquered in reality. With the stroke of a pen, entire continents were declared open for domination. Lands could be seized, people could be exploited, and human beings could be reduced to property forever. These decrees did more than justify conquest. They embedded slavery into law, religion, and empire building itself. Violence was reframed as divine permission. Greed was recast as destiny. What followed was not chaos, but order, an organized system designed to extract wealth while erasing humanity. This system would reshape Africa, the Americas, and Europe, laying foundations for global power structures that still influence our world today. Yet most classrooms summarize this era in a few softened sentences: dates, ships, and numbers, without confronting how deeply intentional it all was, without asking who benefited, who suffered, and why the truth was later sanitized. This is not just history buried in the past. It is the architecture beneath modern wealth, borders, and inequality. In this video, we are not here to shock for attention or provoke for clicks. We are here to tell the story honestly, calmly, clearly, and fully, because understanding the real origins of the slave trade changes how we see history, power, and responsibility today. If you value truth over comfort, context over myths, and history told without filters, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. What you are about to hear was never meant to be forgotten, and it was never meant to be remembered this way. What began as religious permission and imperial ambition did not remain an abstract idea written in decrees or sealed in royal archives. By the 16th century, those justifications hardened into a system deliberate, organized, and built around a single, devastating principle: race. Human difference, once shaped by language, culture, and geography, was reduced to a hierarchy that decided who could be owned and who could not. In this moment, slavery ceased to be a temporary condition tied to war or debt and became something far more enduring, inherited, and absolute. Across Europe, Africa, and the Americas, a new logic took hold. Skin color was transformed into destiny. African identity, in all its complexity and diversity, was flattened into a category created for exploitation. This was not accidental. Laws were written, trade routes were secured, and institutions were aligned to ensure that this system could sustain itself across generations. What followed was the largest forced migration in recorded history, not driven by natural disaster or famine, but by design. Millions of Africans were uprooted from their homelands and pushed into an expanding global economy that demanded labor without limits. Villages were emptied. Families were fractured. Entire regions were reshaped by fear and instability as human beings were turned into commodities that could be counted, insured, and exchanged. The Atlantic Ocean became not a boundary, but a corridor of transformation, carrying people away from everything familiar toward lives they did not choose and could not escape. This migration did more than move bodies across continents. It planted the foundations of the African diaspora, scattering people of shared ancestry across the Americas while severing them from languages, names, and histories that had defined them for centuries. In the Caribbean, in Brazil, in North America, African cultures were forced to adapt under brutal conditions. blending memory and survival into new identities that carried echoes of the past even as they were denied the right to remember it openly. Songs, rhythms, spiritual practices, and oral traditions became vessels of continuity, quietly preserving humanity where the system sought to erase it. As this race-based order expanded, it reshaped the societies that enforced it. Colonies became economies built on coerced labor, and wealth accumulated at extraordinary speed for those who controlled land, ships, and markets. Over time, the logic of racial hierarchy seeped into law, custom, and belief, redefining freedom as something reserved for some and denied to others by birth. Generations were born into conditions they did not choose, their futures predetermined long before they could speak or walk, while those who profited from their labor came to see the system not as violence, but as normal. Yet even within this carefully constructed world, the human spirit resisted reduction. The people forced into this migration did not arrive as empty vessels. They carried knowledge of agriculture, craftsmanship, medicine, and community, and they adapted these skills wherever they were taken. They forged families under impossible constraints, found meaning in shared suffering, and nurtured forms of resistance that ranged from quiet endurance to open defiance. The diaspora that emerged was not merely the result of displacement. It was also the product of survival. To understand this system is to see that it was never only about the past. The racial categories created to justify slavery did not disappear when laws changed. They lingered, shaping perceptions, opportunities, and power long after the ships stopped crossing the ocean. What began in the 16th century as a calculated economic and political project left a legacy that continues to influence the modern world. The African diaspora stands as living evidence of that history, not only as a record of suffering, but as proof that even under the weight of an imposed system, humanity endured, adapted, and refused to vanish. As the race-based system of slavery hardened and spread, it required something more than ideology to survive. It needed logistics, financing, and a global network capable of turning human suffering into predictable profit. Over time, that network stretched across oceans and continents, binding Europe, Africa, and the Americas into a single economic machine. Within this system, an estimated 12.5 million African men, women, and children were forced across the Atlantic, not along one simple path, but through a web of routes far more complex than the familiar image of a neat triangle. The popular version of history often presents the trade as a closed loop. Ships left Europe with goods, exchanged them in Africa for captives, crossed the Atlantic, and returned home with sugar, tobacco, or cotton. In reality, the traffic moved in many directions at once. Some voyages began in the Americas and sailed directly to African ports. Others never touched Europe at all, carrying people from Africa to Brazil or the Caribbean and returning with locally produced goods. Ports such as Luanda, Rio de Janeiro, Havana, Charleston, and Kingston became hubs in a constantly shifting system, each feeding the demand for labor that plantations and mines could never satisfy. This flexibility made the trade both resilient and expansive. When one route became risky or regulated, another opened. When one empire faced resistance or war, competitors stepped in. Human lives were treated as interchangeable units within a global supply chain, their value calculated not by who they were, but by how efficiently they could be transported and worked. Insurance policies were written on ships and cargo, and that cargo included people whose survival was weighed against profit margins. Losses were expected, planned for, and absorbed as the cost of doing business. The wealth generated by this system flowed outward in visible and invisible ways. In Europe, it financed ports, shipyards, banks, and industries that fueled industrial growth, merchants reinvested their gains into factories. Political influence and social status, embedding the profits of slavery into the foundations of modern economies. In the Americas, plantation landscapes expanded as forests were cleared and monoculture replaced diverse ecosystems, reshaping land and labor alike. Cities grew around slave markets, docks, and warehouses, their prosperity inseparable from the suffering that sustained them. Africa, by contrast, paid a different price. The constant demand for captives destabilized regions and redirected economic activity toward extraction rather than development. Warfare intensified as rival groups competed for control over trade routes and access to European buyers. Skilled laborers, farmers, and artisans were removed in staggering numbers, draining communities of people whose knowledge and experience had sustained them for generations. The long-term consequences of this loss would ripple outward, weakening societies even after the trade itself began to decline. Yet within this immense system, the forced migration of millions also carried unintended consequences. As Africans were dispersed across the Atlantic world, they reshaped the cultures of the places they were taken. Agricultural techniques, foodways, music, language, and belief systems crossed oceans alongside them, quietly influencing societies that claimed to own their bodies but could never fully control their humanity. The wealth extracted from their labor built empires, but the cultures they carried helped build nations. Understanding the scale and structure of this trade reveals why it cannot be reduced to a simplified diagram or a few lines in a textbook. It was not a peripheral episode in history, but a central engine of global transformation. The Atlantic routes that carried enslaved Africans did more than move people. They moved power, wealth, and ideas in ways that continue to shape the modern world. To trace those routes honestly is to recognize that the prosperity of some was inseparable from the displacement of millions, and that the echoes of those crossings still travel with us today. As the global machinery of the slave trade expanded and routes multiplied across the Atlantic world, the human cost of this system became concentrated in a single, terrifying experience: the ocean crossing itself. This journey, later known as the Middle Passage, was where ideology, economics, and logistics collided with human bodies in the most intimate and devastating way. The people forced onto these ships were no longer seen as individuals with names, histories, or families, but as cargo whose survival was secondary to profit. It was here, between continents, that the brutality of the system revealed its true nature. Once aboard, space became a weapon. Women and children were packed into narrow holds designed to maximize numbers rather than preserve life. Movement was restricted. Air was, and light barely reached below deck. Days blurred into nights as the ship rolled endlessly across the ocean, carrying hundreds of people who had no understanding of where they were being taken or whether they would ever touch land again. In these confined spaces, disease spread rapidly. Fevers, infections, and weakness thrived where cleanliness was impossible and exhaustion constant. Food and water, rationed to minimize cost, were often insufficient. Hunger gnawed relentlessly, while dehydration weakened already fragile bodies. Those who could not eat or who fell ill were sometimes punished rather than helped, treated as liabilities instead of human beings in need of care. The line between survival and death grew thin, and many crossed it quietly, their bodies succumbing to conditions that were neither accidental nor unforeseen. Violence was not limited to neglect. Control was enforced through fear, and fear was enforced through cruelty. Physical punishment was used to suppress resistance and break spirits, creating an atmosphere in which obedience was extracted through suffering. Women and girls faced additional terror. living under constant threat from those who held absolute power over them. The trauma inflicted during this crossing did not end with the voyage. It followed survivors into the rest of their lives, shaping memories that could never be erased. Death became an expected presence. Nearly 2 million people did not survive the Atlantic crossing, their lives ending far from home, without ceremony or remembrance. Their bodies were cast into the ocean, transforming the sea itself into an unmarked graveyard. Each loss was calculated into the cost of the voyage, absorbed into ledgers and insurance claims. As though human lives could be reduced to numbers without consequence, the ships continued onward, carrying the living alongside the memory of the dead. And yet, even in these conditions, humanity did not vanish. Some resisted in quiet ways, refusing food, sharing comfort where possible, or holding on to fragments of language and song. Others attempted escape by choosing the ocean over bondage, acts born not of despair alone, but of a refusal to accept a life defined entirely by captivity. These moments of resistance, however small, revealed that the system could dominate bodies but never fully extinguish will. The Middle Passage was not simply a route between Africa and the Americas. It was a transformation enforced through suffering. Those who survived emerged altered, carrying both physical scars and emotional wounds that shaped the societies they were forced into. Communities in the Americas were built not only on their labor, but on the trauma they carried across the water, trauma that echoed through generations. To understand this crossing is to understand why the slave trade cannot be discussed only in terms of economics or empire. The wealth accumulated on distant shores was inseparable from the suffering endured in these floating prisons. The Atlantic, once imagined as a space of opportunity and connection, became a silent witness to one of history's greatest human tragedies. And though centuries have passed, the memory of those voyages remains essential, reminding us that behind every statistic lies a life interrupted, a future stolen, and a truth that demands to be remembered. When the ships finally reached shore and the survivors of the Atlantic crossing were forced onto unfamiliar land, the violence of the system did not end. It simply changed form. What had been enforced through chains and confinement at sea was now sustained through relentless labor on land. Plantations, workshops, mines, and ports became the next stage in a global process that transformed human suffering into immense wealth. The people who had survived the voyage were compelled to work from dawn to night. Their bodies turned into instruments of production within an expanding economic order that reached far beyond the fields they labored in. Plantations producing sugar, cotton, tobacco, coffee, and rice were not isolated enterprises. They were engines of a rapidly growing global economy. Raw materials extracted through forced labor flowed into European factories, where they were refined, manufactured, and sold across international markets. Profits returned to merchants, investors, and governments, financing banks, ports, shipping companies, and early industrial expansion. In this way, enslaved labor became a hidden foundation of modern capitalism, powering growth while remaining deliberately invisible to those who benefited most. To sustain this system, law and custom were carefully constructed to ensure permanence. Slavery was not treated as a temporary condition, but as a status passed from parent to child, binding generations into the same fate. Birth itself became a mechanism of continuity, ensuring that the labor force renewed itself without the need for constant new arrivals. Legal codes reinforced this reality, defining people as property and placing their lives entirely under the control of others. Through these frameworks, exploitation became orderly, predictable, and protected by institutions that claimed legitimacy. Daily life within this system was shaped by routine and control. Work was organized to extract maximum output, with little regard for long-term health or well-being. Children were introduced to labor at a young age, learning early that their value was measured by productivity rather than humanity. Families were formed under constant threat of separation, as individuals could be transferred or sold whenever profit demanded it. Despite these conditions, people built relationships, preserved cultural memory, and found ways to endure within structures designed to deny them autonomy. The reach of this labor extended far beyond the plantations themselves. Urban centers prospered as trade expanded, while insurance companies, shipping firms, and manufacturers thrived by supporting and protecting the system. Everyday goods consumed across Europe and the Americas carried the unseen imprint of forced labor, linking distant consumers to lives they would never witness. Over time, wealth accumulated unevenly, shaping social hierarchies and national power in ways that continued long after formal slavery ended. Yet the system was never as stable as it appeared. Resistance took many forms, from subtle acts of non-compliance to organized efforts that challenged authority and disrupted production. These acts reminded those in power that control was never absolute and that the system depended on constant enforcement. Even so, the structures of law and economy proved resilient, adapting to maintain exploitation while presenting it as natural or necessary. As generations passed, slavery became embedded not only in economic practices but in social identities and inherited inequality. The consequences did not vanish with emancipation. They lingered in patterns of land ownership, access to education, and accumulated wealth. The global economy that emerged carried forward advantages built during this period, while the descendants of those who labored without reward continued to face the long shadow of a system designed to reproduce itself. Understanding this stage of the story reveals how forced labor was not a peripheral feature of global development, but a central engine driving it. The plantations were connected to factories, markets, and financial institutions across continents, forming a network that converted human lives into lasting power and prosperity for some, and enduring disadvantage for others. It is within this continuity, stretching from the fields to the modern world, that the true legacy of enslaved labor can be seen. Despite the immense weight of repression, the story does not end with silence or submission. Wherever slavery existed, resistance existed alongside it, woven quietly and persistently into everyday life. Some acts were visible and defiant, others subtle and easily overlooked, but together they formed a constant refusal to be erased. Survival itself became an act of resistance, as people preserved language, memory, belief, and family bonds in a world designed to strip them away. Even under systems built to control every movement, enslaved people asserted their humanity in ways that could not be fully extinguished. Rebellions erupted despite overwhelming odds, not because success was guaranteed, but because dignity demanded action. These moments of uprising sent shockwaves through empires, exposing the fragility of systems that depended on fear and force. Yet resistance was not only found in open confrontation. It lived in songs that carried hidden meaning, in skills passed quietly between generations, and in communities that found ways to endure despite constant pressure. These forms of resistance did not always overturn the system, but they challenged its claim to total domination. When slavery formally ended, many assumed the story had reached its conclusion. In reality, it had simply entered a new chapter. The structures built during centuries of exploitation did not disappear overnight. Wealth accumulated through forced labor remained concentrated, while those who had endured exploitation were released into societies that offered freedom without equality. Laws changed, but access to land, education, and opportunity remained deeply uneven, shaped by the past even when it went unspoken. Today, the legacy of this history can still be seen in patterns of racial inequality and economic disparity that span generations. These outcomes are not accidents, nor are they disconnected from the past. They are the result of systems carefully constructed over centuries. Systems that distributed advantage and disadvantage along lines that continue to shape lives. Understanding this connection does not assign guilt to individuals, but it does demand honesty from societies that inherited the benefits. An honest reckoning with history is not about reopening old wounds for the sake of blame. It is about understanding how the present was built and why certain inequalities persist despite progress. Without that clarity, conversations about justice and equality remain incomplete, detached from the forces that shaped them. History, when told truthfully, offers context rather than comfort, and understanding rather than denial. This story matters because it reminds us that the past is never truly past. It lives in institutions, economies, and social relationships, influencing outcomes long after the original events have faded from memory. By listening carefully and confronting the full scope of this history, we gain the tools to question inherited narratives and to imagine a future built on greater awareness and fairness. Thank you for taking the time to watch and reflect on this story. If you found value in exploring history with honesty and depth, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these conversations alive and ensures that stories often simplified or overlooked continue to be told with the seriousness they deserve.